Story 1. On January the 12th, 2024, my life, which was happy, healthy and successful, was turned upside down by one Friday night. This is a story about party drugs. It's also a journey of life and death that I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams. Some people might see my story as a case study at the intersection of brain science, medicine, pharmaceuticals and policy. Others might see it as a terrifying dive into the extremes of the human mind. For me, telling this story here now for the first time 10 months later is like therapy. It's about putting together the pieces of a shattered life and heart into one broken mosaic. Here goes. At my brother's 50th birthday party in Cabo, Mexico, along with other party guests, I was offered cocaine. I'm not a regular user, but I'm also not a novice. I'm a typical millennial in that I've never actively looked for drugs, but I'm not afraid to try something passed around by friends. For context, I'm a responsible, well-educated guy with several advanced degrees. I manage a small, successful international company. This background isn't to brag, but to show that until January, I lived a drama-free life, successful by any measure. I'm also naturally an understated middle child, so making noise or having weird stuff happen isn't my thing. Until that night, I'd coasted through life without anything big ever going wrong. Being in my early 40s, my partying days have been over for a while, and January was the first time in over a decade, since business school, that I touched party drugs. Over several hours at a place called Bagatelle, where the first dinner of the 3-day celebration took place, I had more than a dozen lines or bumps of coke while sipping rum. It was a festive, if over-the-top, scene as our group of 40 danced on top of the long birthday table, stepping over dinner plates. Waiters carried magnums of champagne and poured it directly into our mouths like we were taking communion. It wasn't your typical Friday night, but everyone was having fun celebrating my brother. So, chemically speaking, cocaine and alcohol were the first ingredients in my blood. As midnight approached, a banker friend handed me what I was told was MDMA brought from San Francisco. I'd taken Molly twice before in my life, once at a wedding in Prague, and before that at a club in Aruba, and had good experiences both times. I didn't particularly want to take it that night in Mexico, as it was late and I was tired from flying out of DC at the crack of dawn. I almost said, "No thanks. But your brother only turns 50 once, and I didn't overthink it. I split the cap in half with my fingers, swallowed what I thought would be a light dose, and kept on with the party. Biggest mistake of my life. Across all years, the one that changed everything. Even Dostoevsky couldn't have foreseen what lay ahead. When combined with the cocaine, MDMA instantly had a negative effect. In my 2 previous experiences, I hadn't mixed it. This time was different. I felt an overwhelming anxiety that I'd never known in my life. An hour into that state, I had to leave the after-party. I was consumed by unease and couldn't continue talking with people. When I got back to my room at Esperanza, I couldn't sleep. This wasn't a surprise since cocaine makes it hard to settle down, so I lay awake, finally passing out after sunrise. When I woke up that afternoon, the anxiety hadn't gone away. I stayed in my room, skipping day 2 of the birthday celebration, waiting for the bad feeling to pass. I'd never had a mood disorder or taken any psychiatric medication. Long-lasting anxiety was entirely new to me. Day 3 came and went with me cooped up in my room, my phone filled with messages as I skipped the end of the 72-hour celebration. And that's when the real problem started. On the 3rd night, when I tried to sleep, I couldn't. No sleep came. None. On day 4, January 16th, I flew to Mexico City for routine work meetings and events. The same pattern continued that night, and the one after. No sleep. By the end of the 6th sleepless night, having barely managed to get through what would have otherwise been stress-free obligations in Mexico City, I flew home to DC, assuming everything would return to normal in my own bed. Nothing changed back home. A 7th sleepless night became an 8th, with only an hour or 2 of broken rest, always waking up with churning anxiety. It was as if my brain had gotten stuck in fight-or-flight mode with no off switch. In my previous life, a restless night, say from a red-eye flight before a big speech, or a tough board meeting, would lead to sheer exhaustion the next evening, crashing hard from the lack of rest. But catch-up sleep never came with this bizarre MDMA insomnia. I simply didn't get sleepy, no matter how many nights passed. After 2 weeks, I knew something big was wrong. After seeing my family doctor, I was referred to a psychiatrist for the first time, who began treating me with introductory sleeping pills, starting with trazodone. These didn't help with the insomnia, and I was rotated to stronger prescriptions. This process repeated for the next month as I worked with a growing list of psychiatrists and sleep neurologists who wrote prescriptions for increasingly stronger medications. These trials included every sedative prescription under the sun. I won't list them all, but I left no stone unturned. Just the categories of sleep-inducing drugs I tried included orexin inhibitors, adrenergic receptor agonists, benzodiazepines, Z-drugs, beta blockers, tricyclics, tetracyclics, melatonin modulators, anti-epileptics, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, and eventually, full-on anesthetics, like what Michael Jackson used. I had every blood test done, a sleep study, where I slept for only 50 minutes, an MRI, an EEG, hired a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI coach, and more. Nothing helped or provided doctors with any insight into what had happened to my brain. By the 3-month mark, I'd tried over 40 on-label and off-label prescriptions. Let me explain how so-called psych drugs work. When prescribed on-label for mood disorders like depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, these drugs take weeks, if not months, to work. But when prescribed off-label for the sole purpose of promoting sleep, these same drugs either work or don't on the first night, with diminishing returns as tolerance builds. That's how I was able, under doctor supervision, to test every sedating prescription in existence over 90 days, searching for an elusive solution. The newest designer medications, like the Doras, had to be specially ordered by the pharmacy. I was becoming so desperate as weeks passed that for one called Kuvivic, which had helped Matthew Perry sleep, and insurance wouldn't cover. I paid $1,000 out of pocket, not knowing if it would work. It didn't. Against these sleepless nights, I tried to wear down my brain by spending every day in the gym and running miles outside. My goal became to tire myself out to sleep, and I was like a warrior fighting this battle. I inadvertently got into the best shape of my life. People complimented me on my transformation, not knowing the dark source of it. Still, nothing changed at night. Piece by piece, I removed as many potential stressors around me as I could think of, hoping that putting one on the back burner might help. So, fighting a tug-of-war with my heart that exhaustion eventually won, I pushed all intensity and passion from my personal life into the background, shutting out love in a way that's haunted me since. At work, I did what I could to keep on top of running a company, masking my increasingly drained appearance and depleted mental state, reminiscent of Edward Norton's workplace struggle with insomnia in Fight Club. Anyone who saw me in those days will know that the giveaway of this scene being fiction is Norton's eyes aren't nearly sunken enough, as mine had become. On days when I couldn't function, I told my colleagues and friends that I had migraines. I was too embarrassed to admit that I wasn't sleeping, something that comes naturally to everyone, including me for the past 42 years. I was also ashamed of the reason for my problem, a party drug, something I couldn't talk about openly. So I endured it in silence. Eventually, the mental and physical toll became too much, and I had to take an indefinite leave of absence from the job I loved. I stopped all travel and commitments, cancelling trips, reassigning roles, and appointing surrogates. Still, nothing I did to simplify my life changed the sleeplessness. I never yawned or felt tired. The best I could manage was an hour or two of medicated sleep. Every week, I hoped that a new combination of drugs might finally bring me the rest I needed. Over 3 months, I spent tens of thousands of dollars seeing top experts within a 4-hour radius of DC. Most of them didn't take insurance. Despite all this, I was no closer to a solution or even understanding what was medically wrong with me. I went to hospital emergency rooms, begging to be put into a coma for one night of rest, like Jordan Peterson had done in Russia. But since I wasn't suicidal, I could never get past triage, even though insomnia is one of the biggest risk factors for suicide. I reduced my daily routine to the calmest activities, ate a sushi diet, followed perfect sleep hygiene, but no matter what I did, I couldn't sleep. It was a hell without relief, not one night. By mid-April, in the 4th month of my struggle, encouraged by my doctors and the few people I let in on my struggle, I took the next step and checked myself into the first of several private hospital residencies. These places provided 24-hour care for this mysterious condition. To put it in perspective, I had only taken about 4 sick days in the past 2 decades, so flying to a clinic and leaving work for weeks was entirely out of character for me. In late April through early May, I traveled to Texas and checked into one of the top behavioral health facilities in the country. It was a private hospital set among beautiful gardens and quiet walking paths. They took away your phone upon arrival so that nothing could distract you from getting well. While there, I was given a different kind of medication, an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It didn't seem related to sleep, but it was prescribed to treat the increasing anxiety surrounding me as I shut my life down. Lexapro, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, works on the neurotransmitter 5-HT, just like MDMA. Miraculously, and to the doctor's surprise, Lexapro helped me sleep. For 2 weeks, my life returned to normal. I flew home filled with gratitude, energized to restart where I had left off with more passion than ever. I jumped back into work and rebuilt the personal connections I had missed. After what I had been through, life felt like a gift that was impossible to describe unless you lose it for a while. I was beaming, and while it confused the doctors, no one questioned the positive results. After all, Lexapro targets the same protein as MDMA, 5-HT, serotonin, which seemed to point to what had gone wrong in the first place back in January. I felt like I had conquered the scariest thing I had ever faced, and for 2 weeks, Lexapro was my lifeline. But then, in a cruel twist of fate that is hard to look back on now, as my body adjusted to the SSRI effects, the insomnia returned. I stuck with Lexapro, hoping it was just a temporary side effect, but by week 7 of the trial, my sleeplessness was worse than ever. I switched to other serotonin modulators like Trintellix and Velazodone, but nothing helped me sleep. The brief relief Lexapro had provided became a bittersweet memory. A few weeks later, in June, I finally saw the chief sleep neurologist at Johns Hopkins Medicine, Dr. Christopher Early. I had been trying to get an appointment with him for months, but he was booked a year in advance because he is a national authority on sleep science and the brain. A family friend on the Hopkins board helped me get moved up the list. When Dr. Early heard my story, examined my chart, and consulted with his colleague, neurologist George Ricourt, who is a well-known researcher on methamphetamine and MDMA neurotoxicity since the 1990s, he told me that the combination of drugs I took that night in Mexico caused a 1 in a million reaction in my brain. Combined with the dopamine from cocaine, MDMA caused a serotonin syndrome that fried and down-regulated my 5-HT system through a rare but devastating neurotoxic reaction. Serotonin controls sleep and needs a delicate balance to function correctly. This is why a few days of insomnia and unease after taking MDMA is common, but not long-lasting, much less permanent. For most people, damaged 5-HT proteins restore quickly, but in rare cases, lasting, irreversible neural damage can occur. Dr. Early told me I wasn't the first he had seen, and referred to cases in the medical literature about a range of neurological disorders, from even one-time MDMA use. Dr. Early couldn't say if my brain would ever recover, why Lexapro helped and then stopped, or if anything would allow me to sleep again. Seeing the exhaustion in my eyes, he agreed to treat my case on an experimental basis and ordered a week-long sleep study for more data. Becoming a test patient for one of America's most experienced neurologists was both reassuring, given the extremes I had gone through in my search for a cure, and terrifying for what it signaled about the road ahead. June turned into July, and the 6-month anniversary of my insomnia was approaching. As this bleak milestone neared, I became more isolated and was losing hope. I hadn't worked in months, retreated from my inner circle, and lost precious parts of my life that meant the world to me. More than $200,000 had been spent on the country's top clinics. I ended up at the Retreat, a full-service medical facility outside of Baltimore that costs $50,000 for every 20 days and takes no insurance. No price was too high to invest in getting better, knowing that not just sleep, but increasingly my life was on the line. Still, after seeing the best doctors, no one could stop the insomnia, tell me how long this hell would last, or if it would ever end. Doctors had also run out of medications to try, the last being the narcoleptic anesthetic Xyrem, also known as GHB, the infamous date rape drug used at Diddy's parties, a Schedule I narcotic prescribed off-label by Dr. Early as an extreme last resort. As the most controlled substance in America, Only one central pharmacy is authorized to dispense it. Xyrem was taking a long time to get approved. It required passing through many safety checks and cost $25,000 per month. Receiving it was weeks or more away, with no indication it would work where others failed. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture considered among the worst. Losing 1 hour of sleep makes Division I basketball players miss twice as many shots the next day. We've all experienced the relentless feeling from a single sleepless night. You don't think straight. In as little as 3 days, sleep deprivation can make prisoners of war give up classified secrets. So by the time my insomnia reached the 6-month mark in July, the once unimaginable thought of ending my life slowly started to creep into my mind as a last resort for rest. Insomnia had literally become my deathbed. Adding to this was a catch-22 situation. It's paradoxical, but the most effective sleep drugs doctors prescribe for life-saving rest also come with black box warnings about triggering severe depression and suicidal thoughts. So my hopelessness about not sleeping was being chemically increased by the same medications I had been prescribed in the hope of sleep. I was trapped in a damned if you do, damned if you don't loop, with no way out between crippling depression from not sleeping or crippling depression from sleeping pills. This downward spiral is how, coming from a guy who, in December 2023, had been the happiest in my entire life, with a thriving company I was expanding, a beautiful waterfront property in Canada, and on the Chesapeake that I had spent years developing into Gardens of Eden to enjoy forever, a skylit top-floor place in the city, financial freedom, world-class mentors and colleagues around me, a dream job that took me to every corner of the earth, and a full heart. In short, all I ever wanted and more. By the time July 2024 arrived, I had become unrecognizable as the same person. It was like living 2 different lives. Because I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think, I couldn't engage, I couldn't feel pleasure. I was a walking zombie who hadn't rested since January. It was worse than anything I could have ever imagined happening to anyone I knew, least of all to me. For an eternal optimist who had never felt down for any stretch, much less considered the idea of ending it all, even in my wildest nightmares, even as something I could understand in others who were suffering, I had never been able to grasp what could bring someone to that state. By July, suicidal thoughts had become my everyday battle. People sometimes say that self-harm is selfish. I used to think that way too. But as I went through my endless, sleepless hell, what felt selfish was dragging everyone down with me. A clean break seemed like it would free us all from the black hole. Let me be clear about something. Weakness had nothing to do with what follows. Those who know me know I'm almost unbreakable. No one builds the life I did without limitless resolve, and no one could endure what I went through without an iron will. But the laws of nature are facts. No one, no matter how resilient or brave, can fight biology forever and win. Sleep exists for a reason. We cannot live without it. There is no alternative. After spending the sleepless night of July 4th watching fireworks on the Baltimore skyline from my room at the retreat, I remembered my old life watching fireworks the year before on the Treadhaven River among friends and family. That memory felt like it was from a past life when everything was fine. 2 mornings later, I gave up my last ounce of hope in ever getting better. Hope was replaced by the sinking feeling of a kamikaze pilot on a one-way mission, called to a final test of courage. The universe had left only one way to end the endlessness and get the rest I had been desperately seeking for so long. Pushing back tears, I scribbled a short goodbye note, remembered one last time the people and life I had loved before this all started, cursed God for cursing me, and hung myself. I've always flown under the radar, never seeking attention, so doing the unthinkable wasn't a masked plea, as it can be for those who choose pills or cuts and rarely succeed by design. That wasn't me for a minute. I had tried every path for help. I'm a quick learner, and my method represented a decision. I made a strong noose and secured it at such a height that nothing could allow me to turn back once the process began. I knew there would be intense pain before blacking out, but I told myself it couldn't feel worse than what I had already endured. So I bit my lip, prepared for that moment and the eternal unknown to follow. Against every probable outcome, I partially failed or partially succeeded, depending on how you look at it. You could call it my first piece of good luck in 6 months, coming at a crucial time. On the other hand, what I did forever changed the life I once had and wanted, the people around me, and everything that followed. I'm still here, but not in a way that feels like me. I have brain changes beyond chemicals now that can't be fixed. No matter how far I search for a cure this time around, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Some people asked how I survived. It's a grim second act. Since my original intent was to share an advisory, not explore psychological torture, I hadn't planned to delve into the next chapter of my saga since July, but because it's part of the ripple effect from that January night, and although it includes shameful details, I've been astounded by the honesty of others as I've navigated so much uncharted territory. So here's the rest of my tale. At the end of my third week at the retreat outside of Baltimore in early July, with the best doctors in the world no closer to helping me than any had been at the start of my journey 6 months before, I gave up. Despite sharing with doctors my growing belief that my end was near, and despite my petrified family members calling to warn of the despair in my voice and what they feared was coming, the nurses naively loaned me a 14-foot charger cable. Outside, in some nearby woods, out of view, I fastened the cable to a sturdy branch on an overturned log above a stream, doubled it twice around my neck, and slid my body off the edge. I've always been drawn to water, and dying in suspension above a trickling creek felt like the most peaceful place on campus I could think of to silently say goodbye. I passed out almost instantly as the noose caught and tightened. Sometime later, no one knows how long, one of the cords snapped, then the other, and I fell. 2 sudden bursts of orange flooded my head with the most intense pain I've ever known as consciousness returned. My eyes popped open, and I jolted back to life like a scene from a movie, but the right side of my body was numb. My fingers twitched, I had double vision, my pupils pulsed, I shivered uncontrollably, and I experienced other strange effects from starving my brain of oxygen long enough to shut it down. This was later diagnosed as an anoxic brain injury to my left hemisphere. When I was alert enough to rise, I stumbled back to the retreat and turned myself in. I was escorted to the emergency room in delirium, coping with the terrifying effects of the brain injury I had just suffered, compounded by the insomnia that had broken me down in the first place. Nothing, not even hanging, would let me escape. It felt like I was trapped in an episode of Black Mirror or The Twilight Zone. Then, in a twist of dark humor from the universe, that even made Dr. Early laugh when he later heard, I became sleepy in the ER for the first time in 6 months. Somehow, shutting my brain down reset it in a way that brought intense fatigue, which none of the 40-plus medications could ever do. So I dozed in and out of consciousness for 3 days, as MRIs, echocardiograms, and other tests were done to look for brain damage or signs of a heart attack. Despite my self-induced asphyxiation, I was kept on the hospital's stroke floor rather than its protected psych floor. It may have been my well-groomed appearance or polished manner that deceived doctors into not seeing the risk, ignoring what had just brought me in. And so, shortly before I was scheduled to be transferred to a trauma unit next door, on the afternoon of July 9th, still in an anoxic delirium, I broke free from the sitter assigned to watch me when distracted and bolted to the 6th floor exit down the hall from my room. Without pause, I dove headfirst down the stairwell center, figuring a 6-story drop would end the suffering once and for all. But security chased and grabbed one of my feet as I went over the ledge, holding on for a split second, just long enough before I slipped through their hands. I flipped as I free fell down the stairwell center. In mid-air somersaults, I collided with and bounced off railings, which zigzagged my trajectory so that I ended up hitting a landing 3 floors below instead of free-falling 6 stories. Shrieks from above sounded the alarm as doctors from every floor rushed to the stairwell, peering down in disbelief through my motionless, glazed eyes. Against all odds, I had a pulse still. Somehow falling 3 floors headfirst didn't kill me, as it did fellow musical soul Liam Payne recently in Argentina. But when the back of my head hit concrete, it affected my eyes in a way that makes 3D vision weird, called strabismus, and gave me acquired aphantasia, which means losing your mind's eye. So now, when I close my eyes, I'm blind. The image of every memory I ever made was erased on impact. I can't picture what anyone looks like, can't envision the future, can't lock onto my eyes in the mirror, can't absorb written words without saying them, can't navigate without GPS, and in many other ways, shutting off your imagination reshapes you. Since I've been told my whole life I'm a visual person, losing this half of my brain feels like losing me. In more dark humor from fate, this new neurological condition is exceedingly rare, just like the MDMA insomnia before it. Acquired aphantasia is uncommon in head injuries because rear occipital damage happens far less frequently than frontal lobe damage. As with head-on car crashes, So I'm navigating this new chapter, once again, in the dark, flying blind, likely forever. After my fall, the scent of liability attracted hospital attorneys like sharks to blood. To protect themselves, they threw the book at me. I was strapped to a gurney, sent to a ward, and locked away for 40 days. Much of that time was on 1-1, which is like solitary confinement, but with a guard standing at arm's length 24/7, even in the shower, even in bed. Still in a trance from my head hitting the cement, I thought about Moses in the desert. I began to talk to my guard, this alter ego beside me, like the voice in the burning bush. Her name was Sam. When I was strong enough to walk, I walked in circles, endlessly. Sam's voice beside me brought periodic news of the outside world beyond the walls. An assassin shot Trump at a rally, but the bullet grazed his ear. A giant bridge across the Chesapeake collapsed nearby, cars dropping into the water like stones into a pond. My world, inside and out, had become magical realism, like 100 years of solitude. Fiction morphed into fact in this labyrinth. My sleepless life had become a requiem for a dream. Given my seeming penchant for turning medical campuses into death traps, ward leadership was terrified of a lawsuit, so that meant all eyes on me, day and night, a never-ending watch. My life was paper scrubs, paper spoons, rubber mattress, plastic pillow, no sheets, metal toilet, no lid, Stockholm shower, no curtain. Strip searches at sunrise and sunset. The pattern repeated, day after day after day. I had become their Al Capone, Hannibal Lecter without the Goldberg variations as company, the Kurt Cobain of insomnia. But their overzealous posturing didn't matter. The time to save me came and went before I arrived. I served my time and was released in mid-August, 6 weeks later. Since then, I've tried to keep going by planting and cutting trees on some land I own and taking long walks with my dog Peanut. I've been battling a level of depression I never knew existed. After a year without proper rest and now dealing with new brain trauma, I keep thinking back to my life before all this began and the dreams I had to leave behind. I can't understand why any of it happened, and I still can't sleep much. Recently, I spent September, October, and November trying every possible brain reset treatment, including 6 weeks of transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, 5 weeks of ketamine therapy, 4 stellate ganglion block neck injections used by the military, and soon tri-weekly electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, under general anesthesia. The only things missing for Christmas are 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. But no brain reset treatment has helped me. My mind is blank. My heart feels empty. It's like there are no more stars in the sky. When I look at what I've gone through since January, it's so unbelievable that it couldn't be fiction, only fact. The sleepless nights that started it all are just the beginning of an even stranger chapter that I'm still experiencing. I've never liked being overly dramatic, but I can't help feeling like I've missed my chance at life. It feels like my life was derailed onto the wrong track because of one night out, and now I'm on a train headed in a different direction. After being in control my whole life, I've become a passenger, just seeing where each day takes me. I don't know where this new ride in my new brain will end up. Fortunately, I can still write, but I've lost the ability to be concise due to aphantasia. Now, I have to say everything out loud to process it. I need to hear it. It's all part of the change. The happy, carefree version of me from December 2023 feels like a distant character in an old movie. Every moment feels like it's from the past. Through the fog of time between then and now, it's both a miracle and a curse that I made it. January 12th will always mark, in some way, the end of my old life. My story from one night of party drugs might be one of the most life-changing stories of all time. I'm the exception, not the rule. But I'm also not alone. There are many people out there who have lasting insomnia from MDMA. Here's one, here's another, all variations on the same theme. Most stories get dismissed by people who can't believe their favorite drug could harm someone else. You can't understand until it happens to you. I never would have, but I've since discovered many lives ruined by this chemical's dark side. If you look up NIH case reports, you'll find cases of permanent anxiety disorders and intractable psychosis caused by even one-time MDMA use in otherwise healthy people, like I was. If you search blogs for long-term come-down, LTC, you'll find many devastating accounts of MDMA causing long-lasting neuroses. People from around the world have reached out to me with heartbreaking stories. Without a doubt, my case is exceptional. As Dr. Early said, it's a 1 in a million neurotoxic event. But if I had any idea I was playing the lottery that night, Even at 1 in a billion odds, even a trillion, I would never have taken the cap handed to me. I loved life too much to risk it. What hit my brain eventually took away the best parts of me. I can't make sense of it, and I probably never will. I'll always wonder what good might have been waiting around the corner if I had made the other choice that night. It's too much to think about. I can't explain fate, but I didn't deserve this. No one does. For 999 people out there, the chances are slim, and you'll soon forget my story. I would have too. Before that night, I never worried. I didn't know the first thing about medications, the brain, or drugs. I never stressed. I was living a charmed life and got lucky at every turn. Everything just worked and was good. That was my world for 42 unforgettable years. But for the next 1 in a million person, maybe my story will make you think twice before taking chemicals that can reshape your mind. We each make our own choices, but from where I stand in this abyss, the mind is too powerful a supercomputer to mess with. It's our universe, and because it surrounds us, it feels permanent, like the sun always rises. But the truth is, we don't fully understand our mind's universe, let alone what can throw it off balance for good. I learned too late. I wish I didn't have this story to tell. I'd give anything to go back in time to when the cap was in my hand. It's a what-if reel I've replayed thousands of times, sometimes every hour, every minute. I can't change the past, but maybe my journey can help someone else's future. People ask me if the system failed me. Here's my answer. Did the system fail? No. No, because taking MDMA was my choice. And while it may soon be legal in many countries like the US, Mexico is not one of them. Ironically, that same morning, January 12th, Mexican authorities seized a CBD lip balm from my toiletry bag, a birthday gift bought over the counter in DC. There's no consensus on what's safe and what isn't. No, because I was treated by many compassionate doctors who did their best. Too many to name. No, because no neurobiologist on Earth fully understands the human brain. We haven't reached anything beyond presumption, so how can any doctor be faulted for not finding my silver bullet? On the other hand, did the system fail? Yes. Yes, because 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, was first synthesized by Merck Pharmaceuticals, the same company that owns the drugs I later took to fight its damage. You break it, you buy it. Yes, because the medicines prescribed to give me life-saving sleep also gave me life-destroying depression. Yes, because nurses at a high-end facility loaned me a 14-foot cable, knowing I was nearing the breaking point from no sleep. Had I brought that cable with me, it would have been confiscated for the obvious risk. Yes, because I turned myself into an ER with self-induced oxygen deprivation, only to be assigned a room beside a 6-story stairwell when an entire, secure floor existed in the same hospital for patients experiencing delirium. My story's worth telling for the questions it raises about medicine, policy, pharmaceuticals, drugs, health, and brain science. But none of these questions mattered as I sat on that log, rolling back the reel of time. I was remembering the people and places I love. The stories told, how to move on. Growing up, my older brother was the daredevil. He'd push me down our hilly driveway on a skateboard. He'd take me climbing cranes at night. How could I survive so many adventures but not his 50th birthday? We haven't spoken since. It's not his fault. No one knew. I was always loyal to my company and the people I worked with. They've been loyal all these months, keeping things running, waiting for me to return, never giving up hope. The last thing left to face is my heart. As a kid, I spent summers at Langley Pool, a neighborhood club set in the woods beside the Potomac River. Each day, I'd see a reclusive old man with long grey hair enter the neighboring forest, stark naked, and walk a path only he knew to a hidden cove. For as long as anyone could remember, he'd been building a half-mile-long dam out of rocks by hand in the rapids. Over decades, he single-handedly redirected the course of one of America's most famous rivers. To this day, his work is visible on Google Earth, just west of the American Legion Bridge. My journey has been full of unexpected turns, but I continue to move forward, one step at a time. People said that Crazy Ned was stuck in a bad loop from a drug trip that broke him, like someone who got stuck in time. Looking back, seeing Ned in my childhood now feels like a warning, almost like a sign from the universe. He was like a man cursed to push stones forever, a comet sent to warn me, but I never saw the sign. And now even the stars are gone. In the darkness, there's no place left to hide from my heart. It has been shut tight since May, hiding deep memories that haunt me. A black car, bright eyes, black boots, 2 smiles, autumn leaves, 2 oak trees, a white dress, 2 hands, a starry night, 2 a.m., a drive at daybreak, 2 hearts, midnight songs, 2 flights, Swiss chocolate, 2 views, dancing kisses, 2 lives, dreamy promises to forever. Our own little world, the one we wanted, all the time in the world, always and forever, our dreamland, our homeland, our heartland, our everything. I was the luckiest person. Those who saw shining eyes. I had it all in my hands, the best parts of life, coming together. But from dreams to dreamlessness, dreamland to wasteland, my love at first sight was taken from me, piece by piece, stripped away, night after night, endlessly, until it disappeared, ruined by insomnia. In 3rd grade, we lived in India. Every day at school, I exchanged shy glances with a little blonde girl with sparkly eyes. She was 2 grades above me, but I had friends in her class. We wrote secret notes. She invited me to her birthday. We played spin the bottle, and we became each other's first kiss. Those were the best days of my childhood. But just as our story was starting, my family had to leave the country without warning. At the Delhi airport, before our flight, I called her from a payphone to tell her what happened. No one was home. I never got to say goodbye. Her face in the 1990 Embassy School yearbook stayed with me for years. Her piercing eyes and blonde hair became my favorite colors, the colors of Sweden, her country. I drew them everywhere. Her smile haunted me long into my teens and beyond. I never let go of her memory. Then, out of nowhere, last year, on a flight from London, she came back into my life, all grown up, majestic and golden, bright like a diamond, perfect for me. Her last words before the sleepless nights took her away for good were, "I love you unconditionally." In another world, where I didn't take that orange pill, we're still together in dreamland, but here, in this upside-down universe, everything is gone. As the anniversary of the first sleepless night approaches, I keep thinking back to this time last year. I was healthy and strong, chemical-free, sleeping soundly, my world in motion. It felt like a new beginning, the brightest chapter of my life. I'd always heard, from the brightest day comes the darkest night. Now I understand. Sleep is like true love. It finds you when you're not looking. It fills you with dreams. Its melody is a soft song, and when you lose it, you lose everything. There is one difference. Everyone knows sleep. Few ever know true love. I couldn't know it then, but I lost both on the same night. One tiny cap I barely remember taking broke my sleep, my world, and my heart, in that order. I was struck by love, then sick with love, but never without love, because I did it to myself. That is the hardest truth to accept. This December, every Christmas carol is a bittersweet reminder of the final weeks of shining eyes 1 year ago, before my story began. I miss those days more than I can express. Last year's songs are like shooting stars, set ablaze and then gone. I'll never get those moments back, the shining eyes, or understand why they slipped away. I hope that electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, erases all the memories, like in the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Meet me in Montauk. For now, red wine and sleeping pills help me get back to your arms. Maybe I will see you in the next life. Story 2. My grandfather was always a bit of a jerk. I know it's not the nicest thing to say about a family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would agree. He was a serious man who never showed much emotion and always had a short temper. He had a constant frown on his face and a look that said, "Get off my lawn," like only a proud older person could. I remember one summer when my family visited him and my grandma. He scolded my older sister for gaining some weight, which made her cry and caused a big family drama that might never have been fully resolved. In contrast, my grandma was the kindest and most loving person I've ever known. When she passed away a few years ago, it was really hard for my whole family. The funeral was a sad event, with my grandfather staying distant the entire time and not saying a word about her. The rest of the family gave speeches and tried to honor her, but Grandpa didn't seem to notice or care. After the ceremony, most of the guests left the church. As the crowd thinned, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was sitting at the front, and even though I didn't really want to talk to him, I felt like I should. "Hey, Grandpa, I'm really sorry for your loss." He turned to me with a spiteful look on his face. He seemed to notice my expression, and his look softened into a sigh. "Thanks, buddy. Tough day for all of us." He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowed hard. In that moment, I saw my grandfather in a way I never had before. He was broken and vulnerable, newly alone in the world, and clearly struggling to cope. I felt for him, and even though we never had the best relationship, I wanted to be there for him. Grandpa got up from his seat and approached the casket. He put a hand on it and spoke softly under his breath. "Don't worry, darling, I'm right behind you." Grandpa and I talked a bit more, and I decided he could use some company for the night. Even though he was difficult to be around, he was family. There was something about him that always fascinated me. Despite his cold exterior, I knew there was more to him than just being mean. No one should have to mourn alone, so I decided to join him for dinner. After the ceremony, I left the church and went to the store to buy some fresh steaks, golden potatoes, and asparagus. I figured cooking him a good meal was the least I could do given the tough circumstances. When I arrived at my grandparents' old home, it was much more worn and overgrown than I remembered. It had been over a decade since I last visited, and although it was vaguely familiar, the wear and tear made it seem different. Grandpa welcomed me at the front door, and we went into the backyard as he fired up the grill. It was a bit awkward at first, but after a beer or two, we started opening up to each other. I told him about my life, my fiancée, and my work, and he seemed genuinely interested. We talked while the steaks cooked, but I realize most people aren't here to read about my reunion with my estranged grandfather. This is a horror story after all, so I'll get to the point. Grandpa worked in prison rehabilitation for his entire career. He started as a prison guard at 18 and eventually became a warden until he retired several years ago. I asked him which prison he worked at, but he avoided the question. "That must be a tough job, huh?" I asked. He paused to think, swished the beer in his bottle and shrugged. "You get used to it. Like anything, I suppose. But it wouldn't be honest to call it easy. You always have to be on your toes, expecting things to go wrong at any moment. You never know what to expect." He told me a few stories from his long career in corrections. He seemed eager to talk about them, and I realized he probably didn't have anyone else to share them with. He was a bit of a loner, and it made me feel for him that his wife, likely his only real human connection, was now gone. We ate our dinner and continued chatting about his work in the prison industry and the many experiences he had there. He had plenty of light-hearted stories about co-workers and interactions with inmates, but his tone seemed weighed down. I couldn't explain it, but it seemed like something else was bothering him, so I decided to try and coax it out of him. "You probably saw some messed up things there too, huh?" Grandpa sat back in thought, his white beard partially hiding his troubled expression. He chuckled and clasped his hands together on his lap. "Yeah, you could say that." As I hoped, he then shared a few stories about stabbings, attempted breakouts, and attacks on prison staff. He had no shortage of gruesome events to recall, but there was one that stood out above the rest. Then there were the experiments. My interest was piqued as soon as he said that. He paused, his head slowly turning. "Experiments?" "Yeah, or clinical trials, I suppose. They can call them whatever they want, but that doesn't change the reality. As far as I know, they never even published the findings, and I'm not surprised." He seemed hesitant to share the details, and I didn't want to push him. The admission alone seemed to weigh heavily on him, dragging his posture down and clouding his eyes. If there is a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. Grandpa said he had been working at the prison for about 20 years when these experiments began. By then, he was the lead guard on shift, and essentially second in command to the warden at the time. One day, the warden called him in for an unexpected meeting, or so he thought. When he entered the room, he found the warden with two other men. The men were well dressed in blue suits with polished black shoes. Both had neatly combed hair and beards with striking blue eyes. The warden introduced them as Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, but didn't explain who they were or what organization they worked for. "No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got confirmation either way," Grandpa explained. It turned out that the two men had already made a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was going to be part of it too. They explained that they were doing an experiment to test the limits of the human mind. They told Grandpa that all he had to do was what he had been doing for the past 20 years, guard the cells and make sure there were no problems with the inmates. The deal came with a big financial bonus, almost doubling Grandpa's salary that year, but he knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money. Grandpa shook his head sadly as he said it. These experiments would later be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The idea was simple. Take 5 prisoners and put them in solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's team would monitor them and conduct research as they saw fit. The 2 men said it was important research to understand the harmful effects on the human mind and to learn more about the brain. But Grandpa saw through it. It was cruel, it was inhumane, and by the end, it was a crime against humanity. They knew that from the beginning, but they also knew no one would speak on behalf of those they chose. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they volunteered for a reduced sentence, but Grandpa knew that was a lie. The 5 chosen were among the worst offenders currently in prison. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged white man who had been convicted of multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault against minors. He had been sentenced to 57 years and had served just 4 years so far. Prisoner 2 was an elderly white man who had been convicted of the rape, murder, and mutilation of 6 different female sex workers over 9 years. He had been given 3 life sentences and was the longest-serving inmate in the entire prison. Prisoner 3 was a black man responsible for the stabbing murder of an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson during a home invasion. He had been sentenced to death and had been on death row for almost 5 years, waiting for his execution. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged Hispanic man who had once been a hitman for a notorious drug gang. He had been convicted of executing 8 people and disposing of their bodies, though many believed he had killed more. Prisoner 5 was the only inmate who wasn't already in Grandpa's prison. He was brought in from another prison, but Grandpa never found out where he came from or what he had done. He described the man as a young, very skinny white man with long black hair and evil eyes. Grandpa said he locked eyes with the man once, and only once, and it shook him deeply. The cells where the participants were to be kept were in an isolated wing of the prison, deep underground. Each cell had to be modified with special features which were done by Smith and Johnson's team. It took them almost a year to complete, but once they were done, the cells were unlike any others. They were completely soundproof from the inside and had no light. Cameras with infrared and night vision lenses were installed on the ceiling of each cell to monitor the inmates 24/7. Finally, the renovations were finished, and the cells were ready for their grim purpose. One by one, Grandpa and his team escorted the men into their cells. Most went quietly without saying a word. Grandpa thought the men were promised reduced sentences to make them cooperate, but this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked non-stop on the way to the cell, asking all sorts of questions. Grandpa and his team stayed silent. Inmate 5 was mostly quiet during the transport, his long dark hair covering his face. Grandpa swore he heard the man giggle under his breath a few times. It sounded like a child's laugh, which made Grandpa even more uneasy. The man went into his cell without protest, and once his door shut, the trials officially began. All the lights in the block were turned off, and the outer soundproof doors were closed. Each cell was far from the others to prevent the inmates from talking to each other. From there, the supervising team just had to wait and watch. Grandpa went back to his duties, checking in on Smith and Johnson's team occasionally, but never going into the cell block. The inmates were to have no contact with the outside world and no exposure to light. Small slots in the walls were used to give them food and water, and they were well fed with good meals, unlike most of the other inmates. Grandpa kept saying how uncomfortable he was with the whole thing, even from the start. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, worried I might offend him. Grandpa just sighed, his shoulders slumping as he pursed his lips. "It's hard to speak on behalf of those you detest, even if you know they are being wronged." His words had a deep truth to them, and it made me pause as he added another thought. "It's not an acceptable excuse, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head and sighing. After just a few days of seclusion, the inmates were already struggling a lot. Inmate 2 had been crying off and on, while Inmate 3 showed signs of severe paranoia. The other 3 remained mostly silent. Inmate 5 was the most unsettling, sitting almost completely still all day, except for when he slept. Inmate 4 tried to keep himself busy with exercises like push-ups and sit-ups, while Inmate 1 mostly lay around in different positions, drifting in and out of consciousness. On the 5th day, Inmate 2 slammed his head into the side of the cell and started bleeding from his nose and mouth. After the impact, he fell and convulsed on the ground for several seconds as blood dripped from him. He eventually lay still, and Grandpa expected them to intervene medically, but they never did. They just kept watching as inmate 2 was left to deal with it on his own. Later that same day, inmate 3 suddenly screamed. He started scrambling around his cell, slamming into walls and babbling incoherently. "There's something in here, man! Let me out!" he shouted as tears streamed down his face. He continued freaking out for a few more minutes until he tired himself out. He then collapsed on the ground, panting heavily, staring up at the top of the cell. He couldn't have seen it, but Grandpa swore he was staring directly into the camera. Inmate 1 began having conversations with himself, acting as both sides of the conversation. The things he talked about started off silly, even funny at times, but quickly took a disturbing turn. He seemed to be role-playing conversations between a young boy and his father, and the things they discussed made Grandpa's stomach turn. He wouldn't repeat or even hint at them, but considering why inmate 1 was in prison, I can probably guess. Inmate 1 then broke down, sobbing quietly as he curled up in the fetal position. Grandpa said this was the moment that made him really feel something for the inmates and question what he had signed up for. These men did horrible things, there's no changing that, but even so, you come to realize how everyone has a story. Were they born monsters or were they made monsters? I won't pretend to understand how these things work, but what I do understand, from one human being to another, is the suffering of life. Things only got worse from there. Screaming and sobbing became common among all the inmates except inmate 5. Alone in the silent darkness, they had nothing but their own minds to keep them company, and that company was clearly not comforting them. Inmate 4 would often pretend to hold a gun and act out shootouts and conflicts in his cell. His breathing would get faster, and he would move and duck around the cell as if he were trying to avoid getting shot. Inmate 3 would shuffle around his cell, flinching randomly and sometimes collapsing to the ground as if someone had hit him. Inmate 2's condition kept getting worse. His head injury likely caused brain damage, and he often had seizures and screamed at the top of his lungs. He refused to eat, and the food he was given piled up by the cell door. Some of the prison staff wanted to get him medical help, but Smith and Johnson wouldn't allow it. They were told repeatedly that no matter what happened to the inmates, they were not to intervene. By day 9, inmate 2 was dead. He had been lying face down and motionless for nearly a full day when they finally confirmed his death. As they rewound the footage to determine the time of death, they noticed something strange. As soon as inmate 2's chest stopped moving, inmate 1 suddenly perked up. He lifted his head and smiled, extending his hand as if waving goodbye to an old friend. He had no way of knowing that inmate 2 had died. It was a weird event, but they thought it was just a coincidence. Inmate 1 continued to get worse after that, spending most of his time sitting still in his cell. Inmates 3 and 4 also showed signs of severe delusions and paranoia. Inmate 4 would randomly burst into fits of screaming as if he were threatening someone, then start sobbing hysterically, begging to be let out of the cell. At one point he punched the wall with full force, shattering his fist into a mess of flesh and bone. In contrast, inmate 5 hardly ever made a sound. He would sit motionless in his cell for hours, hiding his face as if meditating. Every once in a while he would look directly into the camera lens, even though he couldn't see it. Grandpa said he still gets chills thinking about the way the guy smiled and swears there was something downright evil about him. "Let me ask you a question," Grandpa suddenly interrupted his story. Behind the smouldering campfire, I saw him staring down at his boots, swirling his whiskey in his glass. His eyes then drifted to me with an almost hesitant look. "Is it evil to do evil things to evil people?" I thought about it for a moment, a cold chill running down my spine as I wondered where this topic was headed. I wish I could say I came up with a profound response, but I didn't, and still don't have one. In the end, I just shrugged and took a swig of my beer. Grandpa's expression shifted, as if he were at a similar stalemate himself. I fear the day the world finds an answer to that question. Eventually, the team conducting the trial brought medical supplies to inmate 4. As soon as the guard slid open the access port at the bottom of the door, inmate 4 lunged for it. "Let me out, man, please. You gotta let me out. I'll do anything." He tried grabbing the guard through the port, but the guard managed to pull away. He then slammed his baton on the man's hands until he recoiled back inside. The guard threw the tray of food and medical supplies into the cell and slid the port shut. Inmate 4 began to sob hysterically, switching between begging and yelling threats for nearly half an hour. He eventually wore himself out and collapsed in a heap in his cell, but not before muttering one final chilling phrase. "Please don't let it get me." Grandpa ended up working late that night, and just before he clocked out, it happened. One of the other guards frantically called him to the monitor station. On the feed, Grandpa saw inmate 4 flailing around desperately and screaming. He said it seemed like something was attacking him, but of course there was nothing else in there. By this point, the 2 station guards had already seen so many disturbing events that they wanted to intervene and help the guy, but Grandpa overruled them. His chest seemed to deflate as he admitted that, but in the end, all 3 of them just watched. Inmate 4 continued to struggle for several long minutes until he finally fell flat on his back. He then began to grasp at his neck, appearing as though he believed someone was straddling his chest and choking him. He gurgled and coughed, flailing desperately as his eyes bulged from their sockets. In under a minute, he let out a soft gasp as the strength drained from his body, and he fell still, never to move again. Once again, the moment inmate 4 fell still, inmate 1 perked up. Just as before, he smiled and waved while staring in the direction of inmate 4's cell, despite not knowing where he was housed or even that he was there. Inmate 5 then suddenly perked up from his fetal position, his neck craned backward and his head angled upward, but his face seemed entirely devoid of emotion. "Please don't let it get me," he repeated the final words of inmate 4 in a whisper. Like inmate 1, he had no way of knowing or hearing inmate 4, yet somehow repeated the exact same phrase. As the words left his mouth, his lips curled into a wide, almost inhuman smile. Grandpa described it as the look worn only by the most deranged of lunatics. Inmate 5 then erupted into a bellowing laugh, causing everyone in the observatory room to flinch. Grandpa said he was almost scream-laughing at the top of his lungs as his eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets. After a full minute, he finally quieted down, his laugh turning into a hushed giggle. "Please don't let it get me." He then turned and once again glared directly into the hidden camera lens in his cell. Grandpa described that moment as feeling like he was staring into the eyes of the devil himself. He had seen enough for that night, but before leaving, Smith caught up with Grandpa as he was about to head out. He first made casual conversation, then asked a series of strange questions. "Have you ever seen anything weird around here? How are you sleeping lately? Do you guys get a lot of inspections in this facility?" Grandpa didn't say much in response, just shrugging off most of the questions. Smith tried to make his inquiries seem casual, but Grandpa knew better. There was no way to hide the dread in his words, but Grandpa felt it too. The following morning, Grandpa got a call as he was getting ready for his shift. The call was from a frantic co-worker, telling him they needed him there ASAP, but not explaining what had happened. Grandpa arrived at the prison not long after and was quickly taken to the camera room. There, he noticed that inmate 5's cell was suddenly empty. Grandpa asked where inmate 5 was, and the solemn guards just directed his attention to the monitors. They replayed the recording from the previous night, just before 3 a.m. Grandpa watched, mystified, as 1 second inmate 5 was sitting idle, and the next, he was gone. There was no split in the feed, no movement of any kind. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. Grandpa stared at the other 2 guards, but neither of them had any explanation for what had happened. One of them suggested going into the cell to check it out firsthand, but none of them were eager to do that. Instead, they waited around, discussing theories until Johnson and Smith arrived with the warden. Grandpa then informed them of what had happened and showed them the video from inmate 5's cell the previous night. Grandpa said that was the first and only time he ever saw any emotion on their faces, and their reaction clearly showed their fear. "Lock the prison down now. No one comes in or goes out," Johnson commanded, and the confused warden sounded the alarm. Every single prisoner in the entire complex was returned to their cells. Grandpa and the other guards spent the next 12 hours searching every inch of the prison. Despite their best efforts, they found no trace of inmate 5. The search was eventually extended beyond the prison walls, but again it proved futile. Eventually, Smith and Johnson went to search the seclusion cell block themselves. By this point, only inmates 1 and 3 were still alive in their cells. Neither of them reacted as the men entered the block. Inmate 1 continued rocking back and forth, mumbling, while inmate 3 appeared to be asleep. When he went back to work the next day, he saw that his co-workers looked just as bad. They were all called into a meeting with the warden to get their instructions. The warden told them that the experiment was over. The only surviving inmates, inmate 1 and inmate 3, were to be returned to the general population. Grandpa argued against that decision, but he was overruled. Grandpa was right to be worried, because neither inmate lasted long once they were back in the main prison. Inmate 3 started acting like a cornered animal, showing signs of paranoia and aggression. He got into several fights with other inmates, and in one fight, someone slammed his head into a bed. He died soon after from severe brain bleeding. Inmate 1 was more composed, but just as traumatized. He kept to himself, refused to eat, and isolated himself from everyone. After about a week of not eating, Grandpa's team decided to intervene. They found him dead in his cell the next morning. His body was taken for an autopsy, but the coroner couldn't determine the cause of death. The fallout from the experiment caused the former warden to step down. My grandfather was named the new warden shortly after, but many of the other guards left. For a while, management was worried about a legal investigation, but nothing happened. They never heard from Smith or Johnson again, and over time, people forgot about it. But Grandpa never did. He finished his beer and clasped his hands together as he finished his story. The campfire had burned down to smoldering coals, and Grandpa's serious demeanor suddenly seemed much more sad. We all do things we're not proud of, you know? We all make decisions that we think are the best, but sometimes we're wrong. I did it for the money, no denying it. But why did they do it? Smith and Johnson, whatever their real names were. Why did they do it? His grey eyes looked at me as though he expected me to have an answer, but I didn't have one to give. Did they ever find him? That prisoner who disappeared? Grandpa slowly shook his head, his eyes looking deflated. As far as I know, he was never seen again. At that moment, I almost didn't believe him. His story was so convincing that I nearly believed it. "You're messing with me." I called him out, but his face didn't change at all. He slowly turned to me with that cold, ironclad stare he was known for. He didn't need to say anything to defend himself. His expression told me his words were true, and they had haunted him for a lifetime. How does that happen? How does someone just vanish into thin air? Grandpa shrugged and massaged the back of his neck. He thought for a moment, then smirked but refused to make eye contact. "If you can figure that one out, you let me know." He chuckled to himself and crossed his arms. "There was one report years ago. This young girl was home alone one night when someone tried to break into her house. Poor thing was scared stiff, and the description she gave of the man she saw seemed to match inmate 5. He met my bewildered stare as I hung on every word. So the cops looked around but couldn't find anything. Things calmed down. Then about a month later, the same young lady vanished. Never seen again. Never solved." He paused again, then scoffed as he adjusted his posture. "Of course it's impossible, right? All of it is. That's what I'd say if someone told me, but I was there, I saw it." He fell silent again as we both thought about what he had said. I figured it was best to let him share his thoughts, so I waited until he spoke again. "Maybe it's best we don't know, but there was one detail of that troubling story which really spooked me. There was a message written in blood on the front of her house." He paused and looked at me, waiting for me to finish the thought. It struck me then, and a cold chill ran down my spine. "Please don't let it get me," I answered, and Grandpa nodded sadly. We both sat in silence for a while, thinking about the disturbing story before he spoke again. "There's a phrase I've heard before. Maybe you have too. Hurt people, hurt people. People who have been traumatized will traumatize others. Maybe that's what these things we call demons are. Trauma that takes on a life of its own." He paused, and I thought about his words again. It was a frightening thought, but I don't know how these things work, so maybe he's right. It's the best explanation I can think of, but what do I know? I've messed up my own life enough that maybe I'm just trying not to hate myself. His eyes seemed to gloss over, and his lips trembled. He looked like he desperately wanted to pour his heart out and be vulnerable, but as always, he didn't. "Good talk, bud. Don't stay up too late." Those were his last words to me before he left. It was the last conversation we ever had, but his words have stayed with me ever since. I didn't know what to make of his story, but he seemed to believe it completely. It horrified me to know what he was a part of, but I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised. I'm sure there have been all sorts of terrible experiments and trials in the past, but that's not really what this account is about. Grandpa was a complicated man who lived a complicated life. I never knew him well, but I'm glad I got to know him a little better. It makes his sour demeanor over the years a little less intimidating and sheds some light on why he was the way he was. I just hope he found some peace before the end, but after hearing his story, I'm not sure he did. Grandpa passed away a few weeks after my grandmother did, so I suppose he was right when he shared those words with her. I heard from my aunt later that he had been found in his favourite chair, a cup of coffee beside him, with a single piece of paper in his lap with a simple handwritten phrase that shook me to my core. "Please don't let it get me." Smith and Johnson were in the cell block for almost an hour before they came back, looking confused and defeated. They didn't say much to the others, and by that time, everyone was exhausted from the day's events. Grandpa and his team were dismissed, and the night shift took over. Grandpa said he had some of the worst nightmares of his life that night and barely slept at all, even though he was extremely tired.